One scandal was enough to crack the illusion. For years, Angelababy looked untouchable. Too beautiful to fall, too famous to disappear, too perfectly constructed to ever lose control of the story. Then suddenly, the image broke. Not all at once, not like an explosion, more like glass under pressure. Flawless until the first fracture, then impossible to stop staring at once the cracks began to spread. That is what makes Angelababy such a dangerous kind of celebrity to write about. She was never just famous. She was an idea, a face, a fantasy. A version of stardom built so carefully that people almost forgot there was a real woman trapped inside it. That is where this story begins. Not with the scandal, not with the backlash, not with the silence that came later. It begins with beauty, the kind that changes your life before you are old enough to control what the world wants from it. Angelababy was never the kind of star people discovered slowly. She arrived visually first. That was the hook. The face, the aura, the impossible camera appeal that made her look less like a newcomer and more like someone designed for mass obsession. In Asian entertainment, that kind of beauty is not just admired, it is industrialized, marketed, repeated until the person wearing it starts disappearing behind the machine built around her. And Angelababy fit the machine too well. Born Angela Yeung Wing in Shanghai and raised partly in Hong Kong, she stepped into the entertainment world young, at the age when most people are still trying to understand themselves privately, not while being watched. That mattered. Because when someone enters fame that early, identity rarely gets to grow in peace. It grows under lighting, under judgment, under projection. Everyone starts telling you who you are before you have fully figured it out for yourself. And in Angelababy's case, the world decided quickly. She was the beauty, the fantasy, the polished one, the woman who looked expensive even before the luxury brands arrived. That image opened every door. It also built the cage. Because here is the problem with becoming famous for looking almost unreal. People stop asking what else is there. They assume the face is the story. They assume the elegance is effortless. They assume a woman that visually perfect must have been assembled by glamour alone. What they rarely see is the labor underneath, the discipline, the positioning, the self-editing, the pressure of having to remain luminous while the world keeps feeding off the image you created. Angelababy was learning that pressure early, before the major endorsements, before the actress headlines, before the variety show fame made her even more unavoidable. She was already being trained by the cruelest rule in celebrity culture. Once your face becomes public property, your personhood becomes negotiable. People will consume the image first and ask about the human cost much later, if they ask at all. That is why stars like her are so fragile, no matter how invincible they look. Because perfection is not protection. Perfection is exposure. The more flawless the image becomes, the more violently the public reacts the moment it senses weakness, contradiction, or a single wrong move. And Angelababy, whether she understood the scale of it yet or not, was building exactly that kind of stardom, the kind that rises beautifully but leaves no soft place to land. Still, in the beginning, none of that mattered yet. At the beginning, the ascent felt clean. A young woman with astonishing beauty, a career accelerating fast, a public image growing shinier by the year. It looked like success, and it was. But it was also the construction of something much riskier, a star people would eventually punish for no longer looking perfectly untouchable. And once Angelababy climbed high enough, the fall would become part of the fascination too. At first, Angelababy's rise looked almost unfair. Too fast, too smooth, too photogenic to fail. That is when the obsession really started, because fame becomes more dangerous when it looks effortless. The public can forgive struggle, it can romanticize pain. But when a woman appears to glide through the system on beauty, timing, and immaculate image, people begin watching with a different kind of hunger, not just to admire, to test, to wait. to see whether perfection is real or just expensive lighting. Angelababy was walking straight into that trap. By the time her name began spreading across modeling, fashion, variety, and film, she no longer felt like just another celebrity climbing the ladder. She felt like a phenomenon manufactured at the exact point where commerce, fantasy, and public desire meet. Brands loved her, cameras loved her. Media loved repeating her face until it became impossible to separate the woman from the image. And once that kind of repetition starts, celebrity stops being about talent alone. It becomes architecture. Every appearance adds another layer. Every endorsement adds another illusion. Every public smile says she is still untouchable. That is how Angelababy's stardom hardened. She wasn't just famous. She became one of those names that seemed to float above ordinary celebrity logic. A woman whose beauty could headline before her work did, whose presence could dominate a conversation before anyone had decided whether they respected her. That created two versions of her at once, the adored one and the doubted one, and both were feeding the machine. Because while millions were fascinated by her, just as many were questioning what exactly they were fascinated by. Was she a real actress, a real star, or just a perfect image sold at full volume? That tension followed her everywhere. The higher she climbed, the less neutral the public became. Angelababy was not the kind of celebrity people watched casually. She triggered opinions, admiration, suspicion, obsession, mockery. That combination is combustible, especially in Chinese entertainment, where public image is never just personal. It is political, commercial, moral, aspirational, and constantly monitored. A star can be beloved one season and publicly corrected the next. All it takes is one shift in mood, one narrative rupture, one moment where the illusion stops holding. But before that rupture, there was power. Real power. Angelababy had become one of the most visible women in Chinese pop culture. Variety exposure made her familiar, fashion made her aspirational, film and television made her unavoidable. She was no longer simply famous for being beautiful. She had become the kind of celebrity whose existence generated conversation even when she was doing almost nothing at all. That is the point where stardom turns unstable. Because once a person becomes that visible, the public no longer waits for what she creates. It starts watching what she represents. And Angelababy represented something risky, modern perfection. Glossy, feminine, expensive, internationally marketable, and seemingly untouched by the mess underneath. People always want to believe in that image, right up until they want to destroy it. And Angelababy was getting dangerously close to the moment when the image would stop protecting her and start becoming the reason the backlash hit so hard. Then came the night that changed the temperature around her name. Not a career-ending scream, not a public confession, not even a scandal in the old dramatic sense. Just one appearance, one controversy, one crack in a woman whose image had been built to look too polished to fracture. That is what made it so dangerous. Because when a star like Angelababy falls into scandal, the public is not reacting only to what happened. It is reacting to what her image had promised for years: control, elegance, untouchability. So when reports and online backlash tied her to the Crazy Horse controversy in 2023, and her accounts later became inaccessible on major Chinese platforms, the shock was bigger than the event itself. The silence around her became part of the story, and by early 2025, coverage of her return was framed almost like the reappearance of someone who had briefly vanished from the system. That is the real twist in Angelababy's story. She did not just become controversial, she became interruptible. And for a celebrity built on uninterrupted visibility, that is terrifying. Because stars at her level are supposed to keep glowing. Even when people criticize them, the machine usually keeps moving. Brands, appearances, endorsements, public circulation. But once that circulation slows down, something uglier happens. The public begins to stare at the gap. It asks whether the power was ever as permanent as it looked. It starts enjoying the fragility of the image it once helped build. Angelababy was suddenly trapped inside that exact moment. The fantasy had not disappeared. It had turned against her. That is why this chapter matters more than the scandal headline itself. The real drama was not just what she was accused of representing. It was the speed with which public perfection became public vulnerability. One of the most photographed women in Chinese entertainment was now being discussed through absence, restriction, and damage control. The woman who once seemed too glossy to lose momentum was now proof that no amount of beauty can fully protect a celebrity from a system built on moral optics and public correction. And that changed the way people looked at her. Before, Angelababy was the image. Now, she was the crack in the image. Before, people argued over whether she deserved the scale of fame she had. Now they were asking whether she could survive the kind of fall that turns glamour into liability. That is a much darker question, because once a star becomes a symbol of collapse, even temporary collapse, the public stops watching for admiration alone. It starts watching for evidence, for weakness, for signs that the comeback is real or fake or incomplete. Everything becomes more fragile after that. And Angelababy's story was no longer about how high she had climbed. It was about whether a woman built out of perfection could return after the world had already seen her crack. She came back, that was the surprise. Not because fallen stars never return, they do, but because Angelababy's type of fame was never built for visible damage. Her image had always depended on smoothness, the illusion that everything around her was polished, expensive, and permanently under control. Once that illusion cracked, the bigger question was not whether people still knew her name. Of course they did. The real question was whether recognition and relevance were still the same thing. That is where Angelababy's story becomes more interesting than simple scandal. Because after the backlash, after the silence, after the public had already tasted the thrill of seeing perfection interrupted, she had to do something much harder than staying famous. She had to re-enter the gaze. And re-entering the gaze after a public fall is brutal. The audience no longer looks at you innocently. It looks with memory, with suspicion, with comparison. It watches not just to admire, but to measure what is left. And what was left in Angelababy's case was still significant. The face was still iconic. The recognition was still enormous. The fascination had not died, but fascination after scandal is different from fascination before it. Before, people watched her because she looked untouchable. Now they watched because she had already been touched by damage. That changes the entire energy of a celebrity. The image becomes more fragile, but also more revealing. You can no longer hide inside perfection once the public has seen the machinery fail. That is the part of her story that makes her compelling now. She is no longer only the fantasy. She is the woman who learned what happens when a fantasy is interrupted, and the world keeps staring anyway. There is something darker in that version of fame, and maybe more real. Because once you have been corrected publicly, every return is judged twice. First on whether you still look the part, and second on whether the culture has actually decided to forgive you. Forgiveness is never guaranteed. Visibility isn't either. But Angelababy is still here, and that matters. Not because the old perfection has fully returned, it hasn't. Once an image cracks, it never goes back to its untouched form. But maybe untouched was never the most interesting version of her anyway. Maybe the more compelling Angelababy is the one who now carries a visible history, a woman who once looked too flawless to fail, then became proof that even the most polished celebrity can be made fragile overnight. That is a more dangerous kind of fame, and maybe a deeper one. Because now the question around Angelababy is no longer whether she was beautiful enough, famous enough, or powerful enough to dominate a generation of Chinese entertainment. She already did that. The more interesting question is what remains when the myth has been punctured, But the spotlight has not disappeared. Some stars are remembered for the perfection they sold. Others are remembered for the moment perfection stopped saving them. Angelababy may end up belonging to both stories. That is why she still lingers in the public imagination, not just as a face, not just as a scandal, and not just as a comeback, but as a reminder that the most glamorous images are often the most dangerous ones to lose. Because once the world sees them crack, it never looks at them the same way again.